At the twilight of the 1960s, a time of profound cultural effervescence and seismic social upheaval, rock and roll had already proven its extraordinary ability to transcend mere teenage entertainment. It had become a sophisticated vehicle for artistic expression, philosophical inquiry, and biting social commentary. The world in 1969 was a study in contradictions. It was the year of the Apollo 11 moon landing, a feat of ultimate human technological achievement. Yet it was also the year of the Manson murders and the deepening, bloody quagmire of the Vietnam War. The utopian summer of love of 1967 had soured into a darker, more cynical autumn. In this volatile atmosphere, a sonorous monolith emerged from the London mists, defying every established convention and expectation of the music industry. Released in October 1969, in the Court of the Crimson King, the debut album by the eponymous band was not just another record in a year already brimming with significant works like Abbey Road or Led Zeppelin II. It was a declaration of war against the mundane. It was a statement of intent that tore the very fabric of popular music, announcing with jarring clamor and unprecedented sophistication the arrival of a new era, that of progressive rock in its full, terrifying maturity. To understand the sheer audacity of this album, one must first look at the unlikely and somewhat eccentric origins of the band members. Before the Crimson King was crowned, there was an awkward, almost whimsical trio known as Giles, and Fripp, composed of brothers Michael and Peter Giles and a young, incredibly disciplined guitarist from Dorset named Robert Fripp. Their music was a strange blend of quirky pop, light psychedelia, and spoken-word humor. However, the seeds of something far more formidable were being sown. The transition began in earnest with the recruitment of Ian MacDonald, a multi-instrumentalist with a background in military bands and a deep knowledge of orchestral arrangement. MacDonald brought with him a poet and lyricist named Peter Sinfield, whose imagination was populated by archetypal myths, tarot imagery, and a dark, visionary view of the modern world. When Peter Giles departed, Fripp reached out to an old friend from the Bournemouth scene, Greg Lake. Lake was a bassist and singer with a voice of crystalline purity and immense power. With his arrival, the chemistry was complete. This was a collection of singular talents whose synergy, though destined to be ephemeral and fraught with internal tension, produced a work of such gravity that it changed the trajectory of rock music forever. The album does not invite the listener in. It assaults them. It begins with 21st Century Schizoid Man, perhaps the most shocking opening track in history. In an era where rock was still deeply rooted in the swing and shuffle of the blues, King Crimson presented a song built on jagged, angular riffs and mechanical, high-speed precision. Robert Fripp's guitar work was revolutionary, eschewing the pentatonic scales of his peers for something more akin to Bartók or Stravinsky. Greg Lake's vocals were processed through an electronic filter, making him sound like a distorted transmission from a crumbling civilization. The lyrics were a brutal diatribe against the horrors of the 20th century: Vietnam, the rise of technocracy, and the total alienation of the individual. The instrumental middle section, famously titled Mirrors, was a tour de force of controlled chaos. The unison lines played by Fripp on guitar and MacDonald on saxophone were so complex and delivered at such a breakneck pace that they effectively invented math rock and proto-metal in a single stroke. This was the moment King Crimson categorically broke away from the blues rock tradition, signaling that the future of rock would be found in the integration of jazz fusion and contemporary classical music. However, King Crimson's true power lay in their mastery of dynamics. Immediately following the sonic violence of the opening track, the band plunges the listener into the melancholic serenity of I Talk to the Wind. The transition is jarring, yet it feels perfectly organic within the album's internal logic. This track functions as a pastoral oasis, heavily influenced by the English folk tradition and 20th century classical composers like Vaughan Williams. Ian MacDonald's flute becomes the emotional centerpiece, weaving ethereal, bird-like melodies around Greg Lake's warm, natural voice. Peter Sinfield's lyrics speak of an isolated individual attempting to communicate with an indifferent world, an existential theme that balances the political rage of the previous track. Here, we see the band's ability to explore textures and contemplative atmospheres using the mellotron, a temperamental electromechanical keyboard that played tape loops of real orchestral instruments, to add subtle layers of strings that expanded the sense of space and introspection. This exploration of space and sorrow reaches its zenith in Epitaph, the emotional heart and arguably the centerpiece of the entire album. If Schizoid Man was the sound of a world on fire, Epitaph is the sound of the morning that follows the apocalypse. It is a majestic, symphonic ballad where the mellotron is utilized in its full, haunting glory. At the time, the mellotron was a notoriously difficult instrument to maintain, but Ian MacDonald treated it like a living orchestra. The song builds upon a foundation of Michael Giles's drumming, which is filled with incredibly tasteful, jazz-inflected fills and a martial, funeral march beat that accentuates the gravity of the theme. Greg Lake delivers one of the greatest vocal performances in rock history, his voice soaring over the arrangement as he laments the fate of humanity. Confusion will be my epitaph as I crawl a cracked and broken path. It was a mini-symphony that used rock instrumentation to evoke the solemnity of classical music, proving that the genre could carry the same philosophical weight as the works of Mahler or Shostakovich. The most radical and controversial plunge into the abyss of experimentation occurs with Moonchild. Divided into two distinct sections, the dream and the illusion, the piece represents the band's willingness to risk everything in the name of pure artistic exploration. The dream begins as a delicate, folk-tinged lullaby, but it soon dissolves into the illusion, over 10 minutes of freeform, abstract improvisation. In this section, the band engages in a nearly silent, sparse dialogue between instruments. They explore the textures of bells, vibraphones, and fragmented guitar lines, moving far beyond the traditional notion of a rock song. For many listeners, this section was, and still is, a point of friction. But it is also a testament to the band's audacity. They were exploring the silence between the notes, a concept more common in the avant-garde works of Karlheinz Stockhausen or the free jazz of Ornette Coleman. By including this on their debut album, King Crimson was stating that they would not be bound by the expectations of the pop market. They were paving the way for ambient music and the post-rock movements that would emerge decades later. The journey concludes with the title track, The Court of the Crimson King, a piece of majestic, cyclical grandeur that serves as a grand finale. The song returns to the symphonic scale of Epitaph, but adds a sense of resigned, ceremonial mystery. The mellotron again plays a central role, evoking massive, ghostly choirs and imposing string sections. Michael Giles establishes a hypnotic, tribal rhythm that feels both ancient and futuristic. Peter Sinfield's lyrics evoke a dark fantasy world populated by archetypal characters, the Grey Pipers, the Fire Witch, and the Crimson King himself, painting a surreal picture of a decadent and crumbling kingdom. The song moves through distinct sections, including a melancholy flute solo and a false ending titled The Return of the Fire Witch, which features whimsical, almost carnivalesque percussion before the main theme explodes back into the mix. The abrupt, chaotic ending of the track leaves the listener in a state of suspension, as if the cycle of the Crimson King is fated to repeat forever, a premonition of the band's own unstable and ever-mutating nature. The initial critical and public reception of In the Court of the Crimson King was one of genuine shock and widespread admiration. It was a record that seemed to come out of nowhere, possessing a level of technical proficiency and conceptual depth that few could match. Figures like Pete Townshend of The Who publicly championed it, famously calling it an uncanny masterpiece. Despite its challenging, non-commercial nature, the album was a significant commercial success, reaching the top 5 in the United Kingdom and the top 30 in the United States. This success was a crucial catalyst for the music industry. It demonstrated that there was a massive, sophisticated audience hungry for music that was intellectually demanding and artistically ambitious. It effectively opened the floodgates, allowing other progressive giants like Yes, Genesis, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer to flourish in the 1970s. The decisive importance of the album lies not just in its intrinsic musical excellence, but in its role as a conceptual architect. It provided the blueprint for the entire progressive rock genre. It legitimized the use of complex musical structures, the integration of diverse instrumentation, and the pursuit of deep, thematic lyrical concepts. But the influence of King Crimson transcends the borders of progressive rock. One can hear the echoes of Schizoid Man in the evolution of heavy metal and the dissonant math rock of the 1980s and 90s. The melancholic textures of Epitaph and I Talk to the Wind paved the way for the atmospheric, introspective rock of bands like Radiohead. Even the experimental Moonchild anticipated the rise of ambient and industrial music. It was an album that gave musicians permission to be daring, showing that rock could be high art without sacrificing its raw, visceral energy. The visual component of the album was just as revolutionary as the sound. The iconic cover art, the screaming face of the Schizoid Man, was painted by Barry Godber, a friend of Peter Sinfield and a computer programmer by trade. Godber tragically died of a heart attack at the age of 24, shortly after the album's release, making this his only major work. The painting perfectly captures the album's themes of modern paranoia and psychological dread. Unlike the colorful, floral, and optimistic art associated with the late 60s hippie movement, Godber's painting was visceral, raw, and deeply unsettling. It was the face of a generation realizing that the dreams of the 60s were failing. On the inside of the gatefold, the Crimson King himself is depicted with a look of profound, eternal sadness rather than rage. This visual duality mirrored the music's own oscillation between brutality and beauty, solidifying the album's status as a total work of art. The internal tensions that would lead to the rapid dissolution of this original lineup, with MacDonald and Giles departing shortly after their first American tour, only add to the album's mythical status. It was as if this particular confluence of talent and vision was too intense, too volatile, to last for more than a single moment in time. However, the seed they planted germinated and bore fruit for over 50 years. Robert Fripp would go on to lead various incarnations of King Crimson throughout the decades, each one redefining the boundaries of rock, but the 1969 debut remains the immovable foundation upon which everything else was built. Revisiting, In the Court of the Crimson King today is not merely an exercise in nostalgia. It is an act of rediscovery. In an age of algorithm-driven pop and predictable structures, the album remains a startling reminder of what is possible when artists refuse to follow easy paths. It is a work that demands the listener's full attention, rewarding repeated listens with new discoveries in its dense, layered production. Its importance has not diminished with time. If anything, its themes of alienation and the dehumanizing effects of technology feel more relevant in the 21st century than they did in 1969. Ultimately, the album remains a perennial source of inspiration and awe. A landmark in the vast cartography of modern music. It stands as a testament to the transformative power of art when it is fueled by uncompromising ambition and a willingness to explore the darkest corners of the human experience. It is a portal to a world where musical boundaries are non-existent, and its decisive importance is not just historical, but vital. It continues to challenge each new generation of musicians and listeners to dream bigger, to look deeper, and to never settle for the conventional. The Crimson King still sits on his throne, and his court remains as fascinating and terrifying as ever. If this deep, exhaustive analysis of the monumental importance of In the Court of the Crimson King has sparked your curiosity and whetted your appetite for more explorations into the universe of progressive rock, I invite you to join our community at the channel Rock Progressivo y Experiencia Estética. There you will find a wealth of videos and discussions that dive into the richness and complexity of the artists, the albums, and the historical contexts that shape this fascinating and immortal genre. Join us on this continuous journey of discovery and aesthetic appreciation, where we seek to understand the sounds that redefined the limits of human creativity.